The June sun in Florence painted the ancient Renaissance buildings with golden hues as William Thompson drove his Ferrari through the narrow streets of the historic center. His thoughts were fixed on his only daughter, Elizabeth, who in a few hours would climb the steps of the imposing St. Patrick's Cathedral to marry Peter Harrison, a prominent businessman in the hospitality industry. William adjusted the tie of his custom-made Italian tuxedo, trying to shake off the unease that had consumed him for weeks. Something about Peter had never seemed genuine to him. Perhaps it was the overly calculated smile or the way his eyes never showed true affection when he looked at Elizabeth. But his daughter was radiant, and he tried to convince himself that he was just being an overprotective father. Traffic flowed slowly along Main Street when something caught his attention. A familiar red Jaguar was parked on a side street, partially hidden by old trees. William immediately recognized Peter's car. His instincts made him slow down, and that was when he witnessed the scene that would confirm his worst fears. Peter was leaning against the car, locked in a passionate kiss with a woman in a green dress, his personal assistant, Julia, whom William had met at various social events. Time seemed to freeze as he processed the magnitude of that betrayal. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. At St. Patrick's Cathedral, Elizabeth was in the final stages of preparation in one of the church's side rooms. Her dress, an exclusive creation by a famous Italian designer, reflected the light streaming through the historic stained glass windows, creating an ethereal effect. Sophia, her best friend since childhood, adjusted the delicate veil, while other bridesmaids attended to the final details. "How you look absolutely stunning, Bella," said Sophia, using her friend's childhood nickname, "like a Renaissance princess." Elizabeth smiled, but there was a shadow of unease in her honey-colored eyes. "Do you think Peter has arrived yet?" "He hasn't. Responded to my messages since last night." Sophia hesitated for a moment. "I'm sure he's on his way. You know how nervous grooms can be too." The buzz of arriving guests echoed through the ancient church. The cream of Florentine society was present, mingling with international business people and family members from all over Italy. The interior of the cathedral had been decorated with elaborate arrangements of white peonies and champagne roses, transforming the sacred space into a fairy tale setting. William arrived at the church with a heavy heart and a whirlwind of thoughts. He found Elizabeth in the side room, radiant in her wedding dress, and felt as though a dagger had pierced his chest. His girl, so pure and full of dreams, about to make the biggest mistake of her life. "Dad!" Elizabeth exclaimed upon seeing him, running to embrace him. "I thought you wouldn't make it in time to walk me down the aisle." William held his daughter's hands in his, feeling the tremor of anticipation running through them. "My dear, we need to talk. Now, Dad. The guests are waiting, and Peter—" "It's about Peter," William interrupted, his deep voice carrying the weight of the revelation he was about to make. "What I'm going to tell you will be painful, but you need to know before you step up to that altar." Elizabeth felt the ground disappear beneath her feet as her father recounted what he had witnessed. Each word was like a blow to her carefully constructed dreams. Tears began to stream down, smudging her perfect makeup, as her mind refused to accept the truth her heart already knew was real. "No," she whispered, stepping back. "There must be some mistake. Peter loves me. He wouldn't do that." At that moment, the door to the room opened, and Peter entered, adjusting his bow tie as if nothing were wrong. His confident smile faltered as he met William's accusatory gaze and Elizabeth's tear-streaked face. "What is happening here?" she asked, trying to maintain her composure. Elizabeth stepped forward, her eyes now dry and hard as diamonds. "Where were you an hour ago, Peter?" The silence that followed was all the confirmation she needed. The unspoken words weighed heavier than any confession. Elizabeth looked at her reflection in the Venetian mirror of the room, the perfect bride on her perfect day, and saw everything crumble like a house of cards. The murmur of the guests at St. Patrick's Cathedral turned into a deafening silence when Elizabeth appeared in the main aisle, not as a radiant bride walking toward the altar, but as a determined woman heading for the exit. Her footsteps echoed through the sacred halls as hundreds of eyes followed her, a mix of surprise and compassion. Peter tried to reach her, his face a mask of false remorse. "Elizabeth, please, let me explain." She stopped abruptly, turning to face him. The veil, now removed, was crumpled in her hands like a white flag refusing to be raised. "Explain what, Peter? How you managed to lie while looking into my eyes all these months? How you planned a future with me while having an affair with Julia?" The guests began to rise from their seats, the murmuring growing like a wave. Sophia quickly approached, positioning herself beside her friend like a protective shield. "It wasn't like that," Peter tried to argue, his voice low to keep the guests from hearing. "It was a moment of weakness, a mistake." "Her mistake you made repeatedly," William intervened, his imposing presence making Peter step back. "My daughter deserves more than your empty apologies." Elizabeth raised her hand, silencing them both. Years of refined education and social appearances crumbled before her eyes, but amidst the devastation, she found a strength she didn't know she possessed. "There's nothing more to be said. The wedding is cancelled." Turning to the guests, she maintained the dignity that her years as a figure in Florentine high society had taught her. "I apologize to everyone who came today. The reception at the Plaza Hotel is cancelled, but please accept my gratitude for your presence." The following hours passed in a blur of phone calls, cancellations, and whispers. Elizabeth retreated to her suite in the Rinaldi mansion, gazing through the window at the gardens where, as a child, she had dreamed of her Prince Charming. The irony was not lost on her. Sophia stayed by her side, helping her remove the wedding dress and organizing the chaos that ensued. "What will you do now, Bella?" Elizabeth walked to her desk, where a leather folder contained the documents for the planned honeymoon. First-class tickets, reservations at exclusive hotels, carefully crafted itineraries for two. Her gaze lingered on one particular brochure. "I'm going to travel," she declared, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Not as a honeymoon, but as a journey for myself." "Alone?" Sophia asked, concern evident in her voice. "Yes, alone. For the first time in my life, I need to discover who I am without anyone's expectations. Not Peter's, not Florentine society's, not even the Pope's." William, who had quietly entered the room, heard his daughter's last words. His heart tightened, torn between the desire to protect her and the recognition that she needed this freedom. "Where will you go?" he asked softly. Elizabeth picked up the brochure that had caught her attention, a small island in the Caribbean, with white sandy beaches and a pace of life completely different from what she knew. "St. Lucia. A place where no one knows me, where I can just be myself." "But darling, you can't just—" "Yes, I can, Dad," she gently interrupted him. "In fact, it's the only thing I can do right now. Staying here, facing the pitying looks, the hurtful comments, the gossip, that would destroy me." William watched his daughter, no longer the little girl who used to run through the halls of the mansion, but a strong woman rising from the ashes of her shattered dreams. He recognized in her eyes the same determination he saw in the mirror every morning. "When do you leave?" he finally asked. "Tomorrow. The sooner, the better. Sophia can help me with the luggage and the necessary arrangements." Night fell over, Florence enveloping the city in a blanket of stars. Elizabeth stayed awake, organizing not just her luggage but also her thoughts. On her desk, she wrote a single letter, not to Peter, whose messages and calls she had blocked, but to herself, a promise that this trip would not be an escape, but a beginning. The small plane landed smoothly on the runway at St. Lucia's airport, and Elizabeth felt her heart race with a mix of apprehension and anticipation. Through the window, the contrast between the scenery she had left behind and this new world was spectacular. In place of the imposing Renaissance buildings of Florence, a tropical landscape stretched as far as the eye could see, with palm trees swaying in the Caribbean breeze. After passing through immigration, Elizabeth found herself momentarily disoriented in the small airport lobby. Her designer luggage seemed oddly out of place amidst the simplicity of the surroundings. A middle-aged woman with a warm smile and a sign that read Blue Lagoon Inn waved at her. "Miss Thompson, I'm Carmen from the inn," she introduced herself, in a melodic Spanish, mixed with a few English words. "Welcome to St. Lucia." On the way to the inn, in an old but well-maintained jeep, Elizabeth watched fascinated as local life unfolded around her. Children played soccer on makeshift fields, street vendors offered tropical fruits from colorful carts, and the air carried a mix of spice and sea aromas. "First time in the Caribbean?" Carmen asked, skillfully swerving to avoid a chicken crossing the dirt road. "Yes," Elizabeth replied, trying to recall the Spanish she had studied in school. "It's so different from everything I know." Carmen smiled through the rearview mirror. But St. Lucia has a way of making people feel at home. You'll see." The Blue Lagoon Inn was a colonial building painted in shades of blue and white, with wide balconies adorned with hammocks and tropical plants. It didn't have the luxury of the five-star hotels Elizabeth was used to, but it had an authentic charm that captivated her immediately. Her room on the second floor had a privileged view of the sea. Elizabeth spent a few moments on the balcony, watching the waves break on the shore. The rhythmic sound seemed to wash away her worries, carrying with it the emotional turbulence of the past few weeks. After a refreshing shower, she decided to explore the town. She swapped her elegant dresses for a simple cotton dress and flat sandals, a change that symbolized her readiness for this new phase. In the mirror, her reflection showed a lighter version of herself, with her brown hair loose in the wind and just a touch of sunscreen on her face. The city center was a charming labyrinth of colorful alleys and tree-lined squares. Elizabeth allowed herself to get lost among the colonial buildings, photographing details that caught her eye with her phone. She stopped at a small cafe to savor a local coffee, strong and aromatic, accompanied by fresh bread. It was during this stroll that she came across the Central Market, a historic building where local vendors offered everything from exotic fruits and spices to traditional crafts. The atmosphere was a burst of colors, scents, and sounds that left her momentarily dazed. "Careful," a male voice warned in Spanish, while a firm hand grabbed her elbow, preventing her from tripping over a box of mangoes. Elizabeth turned to thank him and found a pair of brown eyes watching her with a mix of concern and amusement. The man appeared to be in his early 30s, wearing a simple white shirt with rolled-up sleeves and jeans. There was something in his posture that suggested authority, despite the simplicity of his clothes. "Gracias," she replied, regaining her balance. "I was distracted by, well, all of this." "The market can be overwhelming for those who aren't so used to it," he commented, surprising her by switching to fluent English with a slight accent. "Michael Johnson," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "Elizabeth Thompson," she replied automatically, realizing too late that perhaps she should have used a fake name to maintain her anonymity. "Italian?" he asked as they walked side by side among the stalls. "Let me guess. Tuscany?" Elizabeth couldn't help but smile. "How did you know?" "The accent," he explained, stopping at a fruit stall and skillfully selecting a few mangoes. "And perhaps the fact that you seem as out of place as I felt when I first arrived here." There was something in the unpretentious way he spoke that made Elizabeth feel instantly at ease. Michael had an air of calmness that contrasted with the intensity of his gaze, as if he carried his own stories and secrets. In the days following their encounter at the market, Elizabeth discovered that St. Lucia had a peculiar way of making coincidences seem inevitable. Michael appeared in the most unexpected places, on the beach during her morning walk, at the corner cafe where she had developed the habit of having breakfast, and even in the small bookstore where she sought refuge on the hottest afternoons. One of those afternoons, while flipping through a book on local history, Elizabeth heard the excited voices of children approaching. When she looked up, she saw Michael accompanied by two identical boys, about 8 years old, who were enthusiastically debating which story they wanted to take home. "Elizabeth!" Michael smiled when he saw her, seeming both surprised and pleased. "Lucas, Matthew, come here. I want to introduce you to a friend." The twins approached with evident curiosity on their faces, which were miniature versions of their fathers. "Are you the Italian lady Dad mentioned?" asked one of them, Lucas, as Elizabeth would later find out. "Matthew," Michael gently scolded him, but Elizabeth laughed. "Yes, that's me. And you must be the famous twins your father talks about so much." "He talks about us?" Matthew asked, intrigued. "What does he say?" "Only good things," she replied, diplomatically exchanging an amused glance with Michael. Like how studious you are and how much you love to read." The boys swelled with pride and soon were showing Elizabeth their favorite books. The ease with which they included her in their lively literary discussion took her by surprise, warming her heart in a way she hadn't expected. "They're usually shyer with strangers," Michael commented later, as they watched the boys exploring the children's section of the bookstore. "You have a way with kids." Elizabeth felt a tightness in her chest, reminded of her own dreams of motherhood so recently postponed. "They're special," she replied simply. "It must be challenging raising them alone." Michael was silent for a moment, his gaze distant. "Carmen takes care of them when I'm at work. After Anna passed, well, we had to adapt." The mention of his ex-wife brought a shadow to Michael's eyes that Elizabeth recognized. It was the same one she saw in her own reflection when she thought of Peter. Before she could respond, the twins returned, carrying a stack of books. "Dad, can we invite Elizabeth to dinner?" Lucas asked, surprising both Michael and Elizabeth. "Please," Matthew chimed in. "You can make that pasta everyone loves." Michael seemed momentarily flustered. "Boys, Elizabeth probably has other plans." "Actually," she interjected, surprising herself, "I don't have plans for tonight." Dinner at the Johnson household turned out to be a surprisingly warm experience. The residence, a charming colonial house overlooking the sea, perfectly reflected the personality of its inhabitants. Books stacked everywhere, toys organized in colorful baskets, and a kitchen that was clearly the heart of the home. Michael moved effortlessly between the stoves, preparing handmade pasta, while the boys helped Elizabeth with the salad. The aroma of basil and garlic filled the air, mingling with laughter and conversation. "How did you learn to cook so well?" Elizabeth asked, watching him finish the sauce. "Necessity," he replied with a half smile. "After I was left alone with the boys, I realized we couldn't live on frozen food, so I started experimenting. Some attempts were interesting." "Dad burned 3 pots in the first month," Lucas revealed, sparking an outburst of laughter. During dinner, Elizabeth observed the family dynamic with fascination. The twins alternated between school stories and questions about Italy, genuinely interested in its culture. Michael gently corrected them when they interrupted each other, maintaining a perfect balance between discipline and affection. It was only when the children were already in bed that Michael and Elizabeth had a moment alone on the balcony, sharing a glass of local wine. "You've built something special here," she remarked, gesturing toward the house. "It's unlike anything I've ever known." Michael studied her for a moment. "Different from what you left behind in Florence." Elizabeth felt her body tense. It was the first time someone had directly mentioned her past since she arrived in St. Lucia. "How—" "Forgive me," he interrupted gently. "I shouldn't have mentioned it. It's just that, well, news travels fast, even here. And I have a friend, Victoria, who manages part of my business. She keeps up with international news and recognized your name." Victoria Smith watched from her office window as Michael and Elizabeth walked together along the beach. From the 10th floor of the most modern building in St. Lucia, she had a privileged view of the couple chatting animatedly, their gestures revealing a growing intimacy that made her stomach churn. For 15 years, she had managed Michael's business on the island, turning his small initial venture into a local tourism empire. 15 years of nurturing a feeling that went far beyond professional friendship, patiently waiting for him to move past Anna's abandonment. And now this Italian woman appeared out of nowhere, threatening everything she had planned. "Miss Smith?" Her assistant interrupted her thoughts. "Mr. Johnson is on his way up for the meeting." Victoria adjusted her impeccable blazer and ran, her fingers through her perfectly styled black hair. Minutes later, Michael entered her office, bringing with him the scent of the sea breeze and a smile she hadn't seen in years. "Victoria, sorry for the delay. I was showing Elizabeth the plans for the new marina." "The Italian," Victoria remarked, keeping her tone neutral as she sat down. "She seems to be adjusting well to the island." "Surprisingly well," Michael replied, his eyes shining in a way that made Victoria's heart tighten. The boys adore her, you know. Yesterday she spent the afternoon helping them with their science project. Victoria forced a smile. How lovely. But Michael, don't you think you're moving too fast after all? She just got out of a very public relationship. What do you mean? Well, I read about the scandal in Florence. A last-minute cancelled. Wedding isn't something you get over easily. Maybe she's just, what do they call it, rebounding. Michael frowned, but before he could respond, Victoria skillfully changed the subject to business, presenting reports and projections that demanded his immediate attention. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was enjoying the afternoon with the twins at the beach. Lucas and Matthew had insisted on teaching her how to build sandcastles the right way, as they put it. No, Elizabeth, Matthew laughed, adjusting his hands on the shovel. You have to go slower, or the tower will collapse. Like this? She asked, delicately shaping the wet sand. Perfect, Lucas exclaimed. You're a quick learner for a princess. Elizabeth smiled at the nickname the boys had given her. It was surprising how in just a few weeks they had broken through her defenses and found their way into her heart. Watching them work intently at the castle, she thought about how much her life had changed since she arrived in St. Lucia. Elizabeth, a woman's voice called out, interrupting her thoughts. Victoria was approaching, elegant even as she walked on the sand with her heels in hand. Victoria, what a surprise, Elizabeth replied, noticing how the twins suddenly fell silent. Boys, why don't you go get some ice cream? Victoria suggested, handing a few bills to Lucas. As soon as the children walked away, her smile subtly shifted. We need to talk. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in Victoria's tone that made her uneasy. Of course, about what? About Michael, Victoria replied, sitting down beside her on the sand, seemingly indifferent to the risk of staining her designer skirt. You seem like a sensible person, Elizabeth, so I'll be direct. Michael is at a very delicate point in his life. What are you talking about? Anna, the twins' mother, she didn't just leave. She abandoned them after a nervous breakdown. Michael spent years rebuilding the boys' lives, creating a routine, a sense of stability. They can't handle another abandonment. Elizabeth felt her face burn. I don't intend to... Of course not, Victoria interrupted her gently. Not intentionally, but you're just passing through, aren't you? Running away from your own drama. Then, Florence, at some point you'll want to return to your life of luxury and social events. And where will that leave Michael and the boys? The words hit Elizabeth like a punch to the gut. Before she could respond, the twins returned, their bright smiles contrasting with the tension in the air. Aunt Victoria, Matthew exclaimed, do you want to help with our castle? Sorry, sweetheart, I have a meeting, but I'm sure Elizabeth can keep helping you. While she's here. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur for Elizabeth. Victoria's words echoed in her mind, mingling with her own insecurities. When Michael appeared at the end of the day, his usual warm smile felt almost painful to see. Are you okay? He asked, noticing her distant expression. Yes, she lied, forcing a smile. Just tired. That night in her room at the inn, Elizabeth faced her first real doubt since arriving in St. Lucia. Victoria's words had touched on fears she didn't even know she had. Was she really just running away? Did she have the right to step into Michael and the boys' lives when her own future was so uncertain? The days in St. Lucia began to take on a different weight for Elizabeth. What once seemed like a magical refuge was now tinged with a constant anxiety she tried unsuccessfully to hide. Every moment with Michael and the twins, once pure joy, now came with a pang of guilt and apprehension. On a particularly sunny morning, Elizabeth was helping the boys with their homework on the Santos family's porch when her phone buzzed. It was a message from Sophia, her friend from Florence, with photos from an important social event that had just taken place in the city. The images showed the world she had left behind. Women in haute couture dresses, men in impeccable suits, champagne glasses, and conversations about art and business. Why are you sad? Lucas's voice startled her, and Elizabeth realized she had been lost in the photos for too long. I'm not sad, sweetheart, she tried to smile, quickly putting her phone away. Yes, you are, Matthew insisted, with that unique perceptiveness of children. You get different when you look at your phone. Is it because of your home in Italy? Elizabeth felt her heart tighten. How could she explain to two children who had already experienced abandonment that her own fears were consuming her? "It's complicated," she replied softly. "Complicated like when Mom left?" Lucas asked quietly, surprising Elizabeth with the depth of the question. Before she could answer, Michael appeared on the porch. His usual smile faltered as he sensed the tense atmosphere. "Is everything okay here?" "Elizabeth is homesick," Matthew announced, making her heart freeze. Michael studied her face for a moment, and Elizabeth could feel him connecting the dots. Her recent distance, the excuses for skipping family dinners, the way she avoided making plans for the future. "Boys, how about you go play for a bit before lunch?" Michael suggested, keeping his tone light despite the obvious concern in his eyes. As soon as the children left, he sat down beside Elizabeth. "Do you want to tell me what's really going on?" Elizabeth fiddled with the edge of her dress, avoiding his gaze. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm being fair. To you. To the boys." "Fair? What are you talking about?" "Michael, look at me. I'm a woman who ran away from her own marriage, who can barely decide what she wants from life. The boys have already been through so much. They deserve stability, certainty." Michael frowned. "That sounds a lot like something Victoria would say." "Maybe she's right," Elizabeth replied, her voice trembling slightly. "She's known you, known the boys for years. I'm just what?" Michael interrupted, his voice firmer. "The woman who made my children smile for real for the first time in years. The person who brought color back to this house." Tears began to form in Elizabeth's eyes. "What if I'm not strong enough? What if one day I realize I can't live far from Florence, from everything I've known my whole life?" Michael reached out to touch her face, but Elizabeth stood up abruptly. "I need to go," she murmured, grabbing her bag. "Elizabeth, wait," Michael called, but she was already descending the porch stairs. On her way back to the inn, Elizabeth ran into Victoria coming out of a boutique. The businesswoman's smile was perfectly calculated. "Elizabeth, darling, I was just thinking about you. I heard your family is organizing a big charity event in Florence next month. It must be hard to be away from all that." Elizabeth felt her stomach churn. How did Victoria know these details about her life? "I have to go," she murmured, trying to walk past. Of course," Victoria replied smoothly. "Just don't forget what we talked about. Michael and the boys have already suffered enough from sudden departures." That night, alone in her room at the inn, Elizabeth received a text that made her heart stop. It was a photo of the twins, taken that afternoon, showing the two boys hugging a photo album she had helped organize. Michael's message was simple. "They asked why you didn't come for dinner today. It's not us who are afraid of getting hurt, Elizabeth." Outside, the rain began to fall, a rare phenomenon in St. Lucia. Elizabeth walked to the balcony and let the drops mingle with her own tears as she tried to find in her heart the answer to a question that seemed impossible. How to choose between the fear of hurting those she loved and the fear of losing herself in the process. The sun had not yet risen when Elizabeth received the call from her father. William Thompson rarely called so early, and his voice carried an unusual urgency. "Elizabeth, my dear, we need you in Florence. The Family Foundation is organizing the annual charity event, and your absence is generating unpleasant comments." Sitting on the inn's balcony, Elizabeth watched the first colors of dawn painting the Caribbean sky. "Dad, you know why I came here. I need this time. Enough time to get involved with another man?" William's voice sounded concerned. "Victoria Smith contacted me." Elizabeth felt her blood run cold. "Victoria, how did she?" "She introduced herself as a concerned friend, said you're getting involved with a local man, a widower with children." "Michael is not a widower, Dad, and Victoria has no right. She mentioned he has a complicated history, that his ex-wife left him under mysterious circumstances. Elizabeth, after what happened with Peter, I can't let you get hurt again." Her father's words hit Elizabeth like a punch to the gut. Victoria had managed to reach her even in Florence, weaving her web of half-truths and manipulations. Before she could respond, she heard a knock at her door. It was Carmen, the innkeeper, with a worried expression. "Señorita Elizabeth, the boys are here. They seem very upset." Elizabeth quickly said goodbye to her father and rushed to the reception where she found Lucas and Matthew still in their pajamas, panting as if they had run all the way. "Why are you leaving?" Lucas asked, his eyes filled with tears. "Who said I'm leaving?" "Aunt Victoria," Matthew replied. "She was at our house this morning talking to Dad. She said you're going back to Italy, that it's better this way." Elizabeth felt a wave of anger rise in her chest. "Where is your father?" "In the office with Aunt Victoria," Lucas answered. "She said she was showing him some pictures of you in Florence with your ex-fiancé." Elizabeth's heart raced. She knew exactly which pictures those were, old images of her with Peter at social events, all from before the betrayal. Victoria was twisting the past to poison her present. "I'll talk to your father," she told the boys, determined. "But first I need you all to go back home. Carmen will take you." On the way to Michael's office, Elizabeth felt her heart pounding hard against her chest. The streets of St. Lucia, usually so welcoming, seemed different that morning, as if the air itself was charged with tension. When she arrived at the building, she found Victoria stepping out of the elevator, a satisfied smile on her perfectly painted lips. "Elizabeth, what a surprise. Michael is a bit indisposed for visitors right now." "What exactly are you trying to do?" Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. "Just protecting the people I love," Victoria replied softly. "Michael and the boys are practically my family. I can't let them get hurt again by someone who's just, how should I put it, on an emotional vacation." "You have no right." "I have every right," Victoria interrupted. "I was by Michael's side when Anna left, when he had to rebuild his life, when the boys cried every night calling for their mother. Where were you?" "Oh yes, at parties in Florence, planning your fairy tale wedding." Elizabeth felt the tears burning her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You're twisting everything." "Am I? Michael has already seen the photos of you and Peter from last month. Interesting how you kept in touch with your ex-fiancé, isn't it?" Elizabeth's blood ran cold. "What photos?" Victoria smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The ones your friend shared on social media. You two looked quite close chatting at the cafe in Florence. Of course, I know it was before you came here, but Michael, well, he might interpret it differently." Elizabeth felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The photo in question was from months ago, long before Peter's betrayal, but out of context. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from Michael. "We need to talk, now." Michael's office was silent when Elizabeth entered. He was standing by the window, his back to her, gazing at the sea stretching to the horizon. On his desk, Elizabeth could see the photos Victoria had manipulated, images of a past that seemed to belong to another life. "The boys came to see me." Elizabeth broke the silence, her voice steadier than she expected. Michael turned slowly. His eyes, usually so warm, were clouded with a mix of hurt and confusion. "Why didn't you tell me you were still in touch with him?" "Because I'm not," Elizabeth replied, stepping closer to the desk. "Those photos are old, Michael. From long before, from everything. Victoria is manipulating the situation." "Victoria has been my friend for 15 years, Michael argued, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. "Why would she do that?" "Because she loves you," a childlike voice sounded from the office door. Lucas and Matthew were standing. There, still in their pajamas, Carmen right behind them with an apologetic expression. "Boys, I told you to wait at home," Michael began, but Matthew interrupted him. "Dad, we need to tell you something," the boy said, his little face serious. "About Aunt Victoria." Lucas stepped forward, holding his brother's hand. "She lies, Dad. We heard her on the phone the other day talking about Elizabeth with someone. She said she was going to make Elizabeth leave like she did with Mom." Michael paled. "What do you mean?" "Like she did with Mom." The twins exchanged glances as if deciding who should continue. It was Lucas who spoke. "Once we heard Aunt Victoria arguing with Mom. She said Mom didn't deserve you, that she was going to tell you about something. The next day, Mom left." Elizabeth felt her heart tighten as she saw the look of shock on Michael's face. All the pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. "Mr. Johnson," Carmen interjected softly, There's something I need to confess as well. Anna came to me a few months after she left. She wanted to explain, but Victoria convinced me not to say anything. She said it would be better for the boys. Michael leaned on the table as if his legs could no longer support him. All these years, Victoria knew where Anna was. She made Mum believe that you had found out about the treatment, Matthew said quietly. What treatment? Michael asked, his voice almost a whisper. For depression, Carmen replied. Anna was struggling with late postpartum depression. Victoria convinced her that you would think she was a bad mother if you found out, that you would take the boys away from her. Anna panicked and ran away. Elizabeth watched the scene unfold, her heart breaking at the evident pain on Michael's and the boys' faces. Years of manipulation and lies were coming to light like a destructive wave. And now she's doing the same thing to Elizabeth, Lucas said, his voice small but determined. She called her father in Italy, talked to people in Florence. We heard her say she was going to make Elizabeth believe she didn't belong here. Michael finally looked at Elizabeth, understanding dawning in his eyes. Your sudden doubts, your distance, was it Victoria? Elizabeth nodded, silent tears streaming down her face. She made me believe that I would only bring more pain to you and the boys, that I was just an emotional tourist who would eventually return to my life in Florence and leave all of you behind. A sound at the door made everyone turn. Victoria was standing there, her usually composed face now marked by shock at seeing everyone gathered. Michael, she began, but he raised his hand, silencing her. Is it true? He asked, his voice heavy, with restrained anger. Did you manipulate Anna to leave? Did you hide from me that she was sick, that she needed help? Victoria straightened her shoulders, her face hardening. Everything I did was to protect you, Michael. Anna was weak. She wasn't fit to be your wife, the mother of your children. And that Italian, she's the same. At the first sign of trouble, she'll run back to her world of luxury and privilege. No, Aunt Victoria, Matthew intervened, surprising everyone with the firmness in his young voice. Elizabeth is different. She truly loves us, and we love her. The sunset in St. Lucia painted the sky with shades of pink and orange as Elizabeth walked along the beach with the twins, each holding one of her hands. The day had been intense, filled with revelations and raw emotions. Michael was at his house, processing everything he had discovered, especially the truth about Anna's departure. Elizabeth? Lucas called, his voice small against the sound of the waves. Are you going to stay with us now? She gently squeezed the boy's hand. If you want me to stay. We do, Matthew exclaimed, and Papa does too. He smiles differently when he's with you. Elizabeth felt her heart warm at the child's innocent yet insightful observation. The recent events had been a whirlwind, but the truth revealed by the twins had changed everything. Victoria, after being confronted, had left the office in silence, her mask of control finally shattered. You know, she began, sitting down on the sand with the boys, when I arrived in St. Lucia, I was running away. I thought I needed to escape everything I knew to find myself. But I found so much more than that. I found you. The twins snuggled up to her, one on each side, just as they did during their nightly reading sessions. The sun continued its descent on the horizon, casting golden reflections across the water. Is Papa sad because of Mama? Lucas asked, his sensitivity always surprising Elizabeth. He's processing a lot of new information, she answered honestly. Sometimes when we uncover truths that have been hidden for a long time, we need a moment to make sense of it all. Like when you found out about your ex-fiancé, Matthew asked innocently. Elizabeth smiled sadly. Yes, something like that. But you know what I learned? That sometimes the bad things that happen lead us to special places and people who completely change our lives. The sound of footsteps on the sand made the three of them turn. Michael was approaching, his face marked by the emotional exhaustion of the day, but his eyes had a different sparkle. Can I join you? He asked softly. The twins immediately made space between themselves and Elizabeth, creating a perfect spot for their father. Michael sat down, and for a moment the four of them sat in silence, watching the last colors of the day dissolve on the horizon. I managed to talk to Anna, Michael finally said, his voice heavy with restrained emotion. After Victoria left, I made some calls. Carmen had saved a contact number. She's in Spain. Elizabeth held her breath, feeling the twins tense up beside her. She's okay, Michael continued, wrapping his arms around his children. The treatment worked. She wants to see you, boys. When you're ready. Is she still our mom? Lucas asked, his voice trembling slightly. She always will be, Michael replied gently, and she loves you very much. Victoria made her believe it was better to stay away, that it would protect us, but now we can start to fix things in our own time. Elizabeth made a move to stand up, feeling this was a private family moment, but Michael gently held her hand. You're part of this now too, he said, his eyes meeting hers. If you want to stay. She does, Matthew quickly replied, making everyone laugh. Is that true? Michael asked, his intense gaze fixed on Elizabeth. Even with all the complications, with all the past, with two families to harmonize? Elizabeth looked at the twins who were watching her expectantly, then at the sea that had witnessed her transformation over the past few months. When I arrived here, I was looking for a place to hide. Instead, I found a place to belong. Michael smiled, that smile that had made her heart melt since their first meeting at the market. You know, the boys are right. I really do smile differently when I'm with you. Dad's getting romantic, Lucas teased, making faces. It's because he's in love, Matthew explained with the wisdom of his 8 years, like in the stories Elizabeth reads to us. The sun had completely disappeared now, leaving the sky dotted with stars. The sea breeze carried the scent of tropical flowers and promises of new beginnings. Elizabeth looked at her makeshift family, the twins playing in the sand, Michael by her side, the future unfolding before them like an endless horizon of possibilities. I think we all deserve our happy ending, she murmured, resting her head on Michael's shoulder. Not an ending, he gently corrected, a new beginning. 3 months later, St. Patrick's Cathedral was once again prepared for a celebration. This time, however, the air filling the historic space was entirely different. Elizabeth gazed through the window of the same room where, months earlier, she had called off her wedding to Peter. Now the ancient walls would witness not a union, based on appearances, but a love that had grown naturally, overcome trials and been strengthened through truth. Are you calmer now? Sophia asked, adjusting Elizabeth's veil. Different from the last time we were here. Elizabeth smiled, touching the delicate bouquet of tropical flowers she had brought from St. Lucia. Completely different. This time, I know exactly what I want. The door opened softly and William Thompson entered, pausing for a moment as he saw his daughter. His eyes glistened with held-back tears. Dad, Elizabeth smiled, reaching out her hands to him. My dear, he held his daughter's hands in his. You look radiant, and this time I can see it's a happiness that comes from within. The past few weeks had completely transformed the relationship between father and daughter. After William visited St. Lucia and met Michael and the twins, his initial reservations had dissolved upon seeing the family his daughter had found. I have a surprise for you, William said, pulling an envelope from the pocket of his tuxedo. Victoria confessed everything. So in fact, it was Peter who hired her to try to separate them. Elizabeth took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter from Peter, admitting his conspiracy with Victoria, driven by jealousy and late remorse. The plan had been to make Elizabeth doubt her new love and return to Florence, where he would try to win her back. That doesn't matter anymore, Elizabeth declared, returning the letter without finishing it. The past is in the past. Outside the room, the cheerful voices of children could be heard. The door opened again, and the twins entered, impeccable in their little suits, followed by a serene-looking woman. Anna, Elizabeth smiled, extending her arms to embrace Michael's ex-wife. The reunion between Anna and the children had been a gradual and careful process, filled with many conversations, tears, and finally, understanding. Her presence at the wedding was a testament to how love could exist in different forms. The boys are so excited, Anna commented, adjusting Lucas's bow tie. They can't stop talking about how they'll officially have 2 moms now. 3, Matthew corrected. Mama Anna in Spain, Mama Elizabeth here, and Mama Carmen, who takes care of us every day. The women laughed, and Elizabeth felt her heart overflow with affection. Who would have thought her family would grow in such unexpected ways? The sound of the cathedral bells announced it was time. William offered his arm to his daughter, while Sophia, Anna, and the children took their places. In the central aisle, Elizabeth saw familiar faces from both worlds that were now part of her life. Friends from Florence, residents of St. Lucia, all united to celebrate a love that transcended borders and prejudices. Michael was waiting for her at the altar, his eyes shining with love and certainty. Beside him, the twins could barely contain their joy. When Elizabeth began her walk down the aisle, there was no nervousness or doubt, only the peace of someone who had finally found their place in the world. The vows were exchanged in a mix of Italian and Spanish, reflecting the union not just of two people, but of two cultures, two families, two lives that had found each other at the right moment. "I promise to love not only you," Michael said in his vows, "but to be a safe harbor for our extraordinary family, built with as much love as truth." "I promise to stand by your side," Elizabeth replied, her voice choked with emotion, "not as a princess in a fairy tale, but as a woman who chooses every day to love you and our children with all my heart." The reception was held in the gardens of the Plaza Hotel, where elegant tables blended with tropical elements brought from St. Lucia. Carmen had personally overseen the cuisine, ensuring that Caribbean flavors harmonized with Italian gastronomy. During the celebration, William raised his glass for a toast. "To my daughter, who had the courage to follow her heart even when the path seemed uncertain. To Michael, who showed that true love knows no borders. And to my new grandchildren, who taught me that family is so much more than blood ties." By the end of the night, as the guests danced and celebrated, Elizabeth and Michael found a moment of quiet in the garden. The twins had fallen asleep on a nearby couch, exhausted from so much joy. "Happy?" Michael asked, embracing his now wife. Elizabeth looked up at the starry sky of Florence, so different from the sky of St. Lucia, but equally beautiful. "More than happy, at peace. I finally understood that I didn't need to run away to find myself. I just needed the courage to be who I truly am." "And who are you?" "A woman who found her true family in the most unexpected place. A story that began with an escape, but ended with a return to love.